Hello? Hello? This is not fun.
Hey, you. Hey, you wanna buy some drugs?
Barry?
Hey man, you're not a narc, are you? You want to be cool, don't you?
Barry.
Yeah, that's me.
It's Josh.
Hi, Josh.
You were in the Rizzo the Rat video we did a while back?
Wait a second, are you that motherfucker who owes me money?
When I asked you to be in that video, I said it was on a volunteer basis.
Josh, look at my eyes. Real close, come on. Real close. Now answer this question, Josh. Does it look like I'm someone who volunteers for anything? If you're not gonna pay me for my time, the least you can do is buy some of my high-quality products. Here, try it.
Barry, this is just fresh cut lawn from the trash.
What do you mean? All the best things come out of the trash. You ever tried that fresh cut Kentucky Blue? Oh baby, I feel like I'm on the Derby after that stuff.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Oh my god, you totally have to try it. You're gonna be fine. Everything's gonna be fine. Well, mostly fine. Kinda fine? Have you done them before? Oh, we'll figure it out. It's a crapshoot. It's fine. It'll be great. Anyway, bye.
Anyways, I think that drug culture helped define the Muppets. Go with me on this. Because during the 1960s and 70s, drugs, specifically marijuana and LSD, ended up being a big significant change to art. The Beatles went from 4 mop-top teens singing about holding hands to long-haired far-out rockers singing about getting high with their friends.
Watch out for them devil drugs.
What I'm saying is, it would be difficult to talk about any art form without the influence of drug culture, whether that's direct or indirect, based on what audiences were looking for at the time. So I don't think it's crazy to say that the Muppets and Jim Henson Productions took what was popular from one of that time's biggest new subgenres of film. So my name's Josh Taylor, this is Modern Mouse, and today we're talking about stoner comedy, its influence on the Muppets, and how they've continued that tradition of comedy all the way to today.
What do you sell?
Eights.
Eights, like the number 8. like the number 8.
Right.
That's kind of a weird thing to be selling.
Jim Henson started in television in the late 1950s with Sam and Friends, and then moved to New York City and started Sesame Street by the end of the 1960s. Meanwhile, the Hays Code, which governed what could or could not be shown on film, was replaced with the MPAA ratings by the end of the 1960s as well, making way for more realism in television and film, including drug use. Basically, instead of censoring every film, the ratings of G, PG, and R allowed people to understand what they might see in an upcoming film. Movies like Easy Rider became major films defining a cultural shift after the Hays Code with nudity, profanity, and drug use.
Oh, no thanks. I got some store-bought right over here in my own.
No, man. This is grass.
You mean marijuana?
And at this point, nearly every film genre changed. Horror and westerns got more bloody, drama could portray more real-life situations, and comedy got a bit more rowdy. By the 1970s, acts like Monty Python, filmmakers like Mel Brooks, and movies like American Graffiti were all pushing comedy into this new post-Hays Code time. Even Jim Henson was getting a bit more wild, moving from Sesame Street to Saturday Night Live. He contributed a few sketches in the show's first year, with a recurring segment featuring puppet creatures talking about things like sex and drugs. Then came one of the most important comedy acts of this era, and up until recently one that I had dismissed: Cheech and Chong. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong began as stand-up comedians, talking about their use of marijuana, politics, religion, and any other taboo topic you can think of. What resonated with audiences seeing them wasn't just how funny they were, but also how much they represented the average American at the time. And their routine became so popular that then Paramount Pictures head Michael Eisner, yes, that Michael Eisner, hired the duo to star in a film based on their stand-up material, 1978's Up in Smoke. If you're like me, somebody who grew up in the just say no era being taught to you constantly, then you might look at Cheech and Chong as two people who were promoting illegal activities, making them more villains than comedians. Essentially, anybody that talked about, joked about, or just straight up showed themselves doing drugs was either a bad person, a dumb person, or both. That was just the impression that I was always given. Needless to say, I had never seen a Cheech and Chong video. Not until recently. This year, in fact. And I'd heard about them, and I'd seen them and other things, but I'd never actually watched Cheech and Chong. And now that I have, I could tell you, they're fantastic. Cheech Marin was representing real Latino culture in a public way long before anyone else was. And their style of situational comedy doesn't feel that far off from things like National Lampoon. What makes Cheech and Chong stand out, and what eventually inspired every stoner comedy after it, are the components that all come together. With the release of Up in Smoke, the stoner comedy was officially born, and they'd spend the next few years continuing to make movies together that further developed what defines the genre. And before we go any further, I think we need to talk about that definition of what stoner comedies are. Obviously, there has to be a bit of recreational drug use, or at the very least, somebody needs to be defined by their love of cannabis or a stand-in for drugs altogether. Take Scooby-Doo, for example. It's pretty obvious that Shaggy, Scooby, and their beloved Scooby snacks are all just kid-friendly substitutes for stoners and weed. And that hits on the next major trope of the stoner comedy, the dank duos and groups that make up the casts. Stoner comedies rarely have one main character, and typically operate as buddy or ensemble comedies. There are duos like Cheech and Chong, Harold and Kumar, Bill and Ted, the guys from Dude, Where's My Car, and Ice Cube and Chris Tucker in Friday.
Puff, puff, give! Puff, puff, give!
Then there are groups like in Dazed and Confused, Grandma's Boy, and Half Baked. And I think that you can see how the Muppets and the Muppet Show would naturally fit into this idea. They're a large group, sometimes broken off into smaller acts or duos, and even if they aren't using drugs, there are definitely ways to read between the lines, just like with Scooby-Doo. Those are two major traits to stoner comedies, but there's a lot of other common themes, like how music typically plays a key role, and often stoner comedy soundtracks are fantastic. There's usually some form of a hallucination scene done for laughs, occasionally a hilarious take on a bad trip. And for decades, the term stoner was synonymous with a no-ambition slacker. And you see that in many stoner comedies all the way into the 2000s. Plot-wise, stoner comedies tend to be either wandering, kind of pointless hangouts, or a series of misadventures with quest-like elements. And sometimes those feature over-the-top antagonists. In Up in Smoke, that could be the police, or it could be Tommy Chong's rich parents who don't like his way of living. If there's one last thing that I can think of that unites stoner comedies, it's the emphasis on the fun, goofy situations that come from drugs, rather than the real negative depiction of drug use itself. And speaking of fun, goofy situations, I think it's time for another installment of a segment we like to call Adjacent. It's like adjacent, but with Joe.
So I've gone down some rabbit holes of film research that I've lost maybe hours and days of my life looking into the history of comedy, its subgenres, and I kind of don't know what to do with all this information anymore. So I was thinking I was going to try my best to distill it down into a bit of a comedy history lesson and looking at the family tree of subgenres that have influenced or were influenced by stoner comedies. Possibly the first subgenre to hit the big screen was slapstick. Slapstick is mostly just cartoonish violence and over-the-top physical humor. It all works if the injuries are ridiculous and don't really leave any lasting damage. Think of Three Stooges hitting each other on the head with hammers, or Wile E. Coyote walking away from an explosion to be totally fine in the next scene. It works so long as there's no consequences. Closely related to one another are screwball comedies and romantic comedies. Screwball comedies seem like romantic comedies because there's a bit of a romantic angle. It's mostly focused on strong female characters, quick witty dialogue, and they kind of come across a little bit more battle of the sexes than they are straightforward romance. A lot of film historians think those genres died out in the 1940s, but you could probably definitely see the works of Amy Sherman Palladino, shows like Gilmore Girls, as being a modern day descendant of it. Romantic comedies don't need much explanation, but they're worth bringing up because how closely related they are to buddy comedies. Buddy comedies are basically a rom-com, but for unlikely friendships. It's pretty clear how much overlap there is between buddy comedies and stoner comedies, though. While stoner comedies could often be considered buddy comedies, for the most part buddy comedies fall into two different flavors, the action comedy and the road trip comedy. The action comedy, you can see movies like Hot Fuzz, Rush Hour, Lethal Weapon, Bad Boys, where mismatched partners in law enforcement usually overcome their differences, become real friends, and solve the big case. And road trip comedies like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Tommy Boy, and Due Date all echo that same idea of an odd couple who eventually become friends, but it's the road trip variety. A very close cousin of stoner comedies is the hangout comedy. Hangout comedies are not necessarily about what's happening or plot driven, they're more about watching some characters bounce it off each other. You see examples of this in things like American Graffiti, The Breakfast Club, Clerks, Empire Records. Things happen in these movies, but it's not really about that. When stoner comedies don't take you on a series of misadventures or go on a big silly quest, they're often just about a group of friends getting high and talking. Movies like The Big Lebowski, Friday, Dazed and Confused are the perfect overlap of stoner and hangout comedy. And look, there's like 30 different subgenres of comedy, and I can go on all day, but this tangent's going on way too long, so I'm just going to wrap it up here. But if this is the kind of thing you're interested in, comedy subgenres, the history of comedy, or just film genres in general, let us know in the comments. It might be something we do in the future.
Good old Joe, letting me know that our deep dive into a topic is never deep enough, and this video should really be 4 hours long. Also, is Modern Mouse a buddy comedy? Anyhow, this is a good point to jump into the Muppets, starting with the Muppet Show in the late 1970s. Like I said before, there are plenty of tropes from the stoner comedies that fit into the Muppet Show. It was a large ensemble cast, many of whom were slackers just trying to put on a show, and many episodes had side quests happening backstage that created comedic situations. The biggest connection to stoner comedies as it pertains to the Muppet Show, however, are the characters in the band Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem. Those characters, who provide the fantastic soundtrack to the show, often look like they just got done doing drugs before they hit the stage to perform with that week's celebrity guest. Dr. Teeth's style of intellectualism fits right in line with the deep thinking that you might see in movies like Half-Baked.
Our gentle morning melodies have attracted wandering admirers.
Or there's Floyd and Janice's speech patterns, which align with characters from Cheech and Chong or The Big Lebowski, with their overuse of the words like man, dude, and for sure.
Oh, bummer.
If you want to talk about language in stoner movies, you gotta talk about the Weasel.
The what?
The Weasel, you know, Pauly Shore basically took California surfer aesthetic and turned it into words.
Right. I forgot that was his nickname. I kind of have a secret soft spot for Pauly Shore films, but none of that surfer talk really stuck around.
Yeah, a phrase like wheezing on the juice shouldn't make any sense, but I think we all know what he means.
Blink and I are cruising the mountain, bro, and we figure we's a little juice.
No, we sing the juice.
I think that's the genius of Pauly Shore. Plus, he did launch the career of Brendan Fraser with Encino Man.
So what you're saying is society owes a debt to Pauly Shore for classic films like The Mummy, Airheads, and Monkey Bone.
I mean, you're making it sound like somebody's getting their car towed away if they don't pay up, but you're definitely onto something here. Plus, if we wait around long enough, I think that he's the perfect pick to play famous aerobics instructor Richard Simmons in a very dramatic biopic. I mean, if you look at the two of them side by side, they're basically the same person, Joe.
The resemblance is absolutely uncanny, and I still think that'd make a terrible movie.
Yeah, don't harsh on my grindage, muchacho, alright? You don't want to tank the juice.
My proposal is that we plant these seeds. And I know you're thinking, illegal! But the value of purple sticky punch goes way beyond just token.
There are a few occasions on The Muppet Show where the drug use is much more clear. An episode where they're recreating Alice in Wonderland in particular, Floyd is smoking a hookah, and while you can say that hookah pipes are for more than marijuana, it's not too difficult to make the association with that drug either. And you might assume that Jim Henson and his crew were avid drug users. It's not hard to look at Jim Henson and think that. But according to his colleagues that were interviewed after his death, Jim Henson would only have a glass of wine in the evenings or occasionally smoke marijuana to fall asleep. In fact, they said that he was more likely to have aspirin than anything else. He did try LSD once though, and apparently it didn't work on him. Take that for what it is. The films that came after The Muppet Show also show their stoner comedy influences, especially the original Muppet movie, which sees Kermit and various members of the gang get into silly situations. Fozzie and Kermit driving a car and making a joke about a literal fork in the road feels oddly similar to Cheech and Chong pulling out a ridiculously large joint while driving down the highway. The Colonel who wants to get a hold of Kermit because he has a frog leg restaurant is comically over the top in the same ways that the history teacher Mr. Hand is in Fast Times at Ridgemont High.
What are you people? On dope?
Top that off with the giant Godzilla-like animal saving the day, a ridiculous waiter played by Steve Martin, and so many other great gags throughout the film. And then of course there's the soundtrack to the Muppet movie, absolutely unforgettable songs based around unity and love, some of the same ideas that came from the drug-related hippie movement. This kinda all has me thinking that maybe Barry isn't so bad, and that what he gave me is gonna bring me some sort of peace of mind. Maybe it's just gonna mellow me out. I think it's time to go have some dinner and see what this stuff does. Here goes nothing. Hey man, I was just about to head out and here, you on drugs? Cool, man. Didn't know you had it in you. God, what's going on? Where am I? No, I don't like this. Is this what my brain's like on drugs? Help! Alright, so, since the other version of me is incapacitated, I think it's my turn to take on the ad read because I'm a complete shill. Alright, you should buy this book. And if you want to learn how to do puppets, you could buy it. I've been teaching myself a few things to impress women on first dates. It hasn't panned out completely, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to keep trying. And speaking of which, I gotta go. I got a date in about 10 minutes. So, buy the book. No, I don't like this at all. What's going on? Where am I? No! Need to sleep this off. That wasn't mellow at all.
Okay, Josh is napping at a super inconvenient time, but that does give me the opportunity to talk about one more type of comedy I didn't get to. It's not quite its own subgenre, but anti-authority, anti-conformity, and kind of a celebration of outsider status are common reoccurring themes in comedy. I think it stems from comedy's natural tendency to want to poke at mainstream culture and question social norms. That and conformity and authority seem like the natural enemies of comedy. There's few things less funny than just following the rules and trying to be like everyone else. Political comedies like Dr. Strangelove, Wag the Dog, and Team America go after the ideas and institutions that authority comes from. And other times it's a little bit more of a misfit, outsider, fight the man type of story like you'll see in Blues Brothers, Animal House, even Office Space. That anti-authority streak can be seen even in things like Happy Gilmore, where the uptight pro-establishment villain faces off against Adam Sandler's everyman. Once you start to see it and recognize it, you'll see it everywhere in all types of comedy, especially stoner comedies. Maybe less so as more states legalize marijuana and stoner stigma is fading, but the stoner has traditionally been kind of an anti-capitalist, anti-authority character. Yes, their goofy nature is most often the joke, and at the same time the stoner is a character usually depicted as content. They get stereotyped for the lack of ambition. They are also the Zen character who seems less stressed. Whether it's fighting cops or simply the man, the stoner can be seen as something of a folk hero, fighting the system simply by opting out of it.
Oh, no. Okay. Sorry about all that. Alright, where was I? Even prior to Disney's ownership of the Muppets, their distribution deal with Henson came with a toning down of the product. I'll fight anyone saying that The Muppet Christmas Carol isn't the best version of that story, and I do love Muppet Treasure Island. But those movies lack the tongue-in-cheek adult references that were so common with the characters in prior years. While Disney helped keep the Muppets alive and introduce them to a new generation with new films, a new TV show with Muppets Tonight and theme park attractions, the edge that had been there with Jim Henson's version of the characters pretty much ceased to exist after his death. Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem became more of background characters during this time, which makes sense since they'd be the ones most associated with the edgy adult humor. When Disney outright purchased the Muppets, there became an issue of not knowing what to do with them. They'd make various TV appearances on late night shows or maybe make some funny internet videos, but nothing ever felt like it clicked. And between 1999's Muppets from Space and 2011's Jason Segel-fronted film, I would assume most people believe the Muppets had completely disappeared. And let's talk about the 2011 film, because I personally feel like it's a return to form for the Muppets. Not only does it mirror a lot of what was great from the original Muppet movie plot, with Kermit chasing down other members of the group, but it features some of the comedy most associated with early Muppets, and that stoner comedy humor, like the 80s robot, or the wacky characters in wacky situations. The insane over-the-top oil tycoon villain.
Maniacal laugh. Maniacal laugh.
The Muppets just simply existing. And of course, the return to tongue-in-cheek humor about drugs. Like, during the tune Life's a Happy Song, Jason Segel and Walter walk by Willie Nelson, who sings the line, "Life is full of highs," giving a dual meaning since Nelson is famously known for his acceptance of recreational marijuana use. What worked so well with Segel's Muppets is that it understood exactly who the Muppets were when they rose to fame in the late 1970s, and it capitalized on that version of the Muppets. Since that film, there have been a few other projects, some understanding Segel's version of the Muppets and some straying in a different direction. I personally thought that the follow-up film, Muppets Most Wanted, was okay, but didn't rise to the greatness of the 2011 film. But the 2015 ABC mockumentary show really did do it for me, and I think it's because it featured a lot of the stoner comedy elements that had worked in the past. Each episode usually involved some adult situations, but also featured plenty of side quests, and some characters just hanging out, turning what would otherwise be mundane into comical mischief.
Bunsen and Beaker, why are you wearing each other's clothes?
If it happens outside of work, we don't owe him an explanation.
And by the time that Muppet Mayhem, the Disney Plus show all about the Electric Mayhem band, started airing, the Muppets felt like they were both leaning into the comedy of the 1970s, while also beginning to move forward in a new direction. But before we get to that, I think that it's important to have context around how drug use, or the stigma around drug use, has changed in recent times.
Hey, remember the DARE program?
Sort of. I was kind of young. But I do remember a cop coming to school and giving us free t-shirts and talking about McGruff the crime dog.
That was weird, right? Like, they had a dog, a talking dog in a trench coat. A talking dog in a trench coat telling us not to do drugs. Like, that was weird, right?
I mean, he was supposed to look like Columbo, but he definitely just looked like somebody who would roll up to my school and kidnap me with his van.
I think the best part of DARE was the pencils.
You got pencils?
Yeah, they were awesome. They said, too cool to do drugs. But when you sharpen them, they eventually said, cool to do drugs. You sharpen a little more, and they just said, do drugs. And then finally, you just had a pencil that said, drugs.
Yeah. Well, I also remember the catchphrase, take a bite out of crime, but maybe we could change that up. So McGruff could say something like, hey kids, you want to buy a dime? Or, okay, what about this? Hey kids, let's get high and listen to Sublime.
You really committed to the rhyming thing there. That's great. That's great.
I've got more. What if it was, public restroom sinks are great places to do lines? Or something simpler, doing drugs will make you feel divine.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, Josh.
Okay, I got more. Hold on, I've got more. What if it wasn't about drugs at all? Okay, maybe this is a environmentalist kind of thing, right? So McGruff says, to summon Captain Planet, may your powers combine. Or maybe he's looking to do a little side project, a little second job, and he says, let's take a scrub out of grime, so that he can like sell some cleaning supply products with his little dog face on it.
Okay, I'm just gonna call it. We're gonna conclude the freeform poetry section of the video.
Okay, but the war on drugs had become a major talking point during the 1980s and 90s, and most people, like myself, had a perception of what type of people did drugs. Going back to my original thoughts on Cheech and Chong. The stigma around drug use was damning evidence that if you did illegal drugs, you weren't somebody to aspire to be. But by the 2010s, that stigma was beginning to change. Larger social conversations around mental health, as well as the legalization of marijuana use, changed the cultural view of what drugs were and who did them. Movies featured more than just slacker teens smoking joints, and what we'd consider the classic stoner comedy seems to have evolved. Movies like We're the Millers or Pineapple Express showed fairly normal people taking part in drug use. Earlier, Joe pointed out how there's so much overlap of all these different comedic subgenres, and it's safe to say that certain subgenres get their time in the spotlight before fading into the background. Thanks to the changing perception, I think that the stoner comedy has taken a bit of a back seat. That's not to say that it can't be a prominent subgenre again, but I think that it has to evolve in a different way before it comes back. So with the introduction of Muppet Mayhem on Disney+, it felt like the show was both a nod to the stoner comedy origins of the Muppet Show, while also nailing the comedy needs of current times. Muppet Mayhem delivers on the references and cameos like Cheech and Chong themselves living in the basement of the Electric Mayhem.
Hey, Mayhem!
Cheech and Chong! You guys went out for pepperoni pizza and never came back, man.
And with anchovies, man.
Yeah, hey, where are the anchovies, man?
Well, we got a little sidetracked by the 80s.
The opening credits with the kaleidoscope feels like a direct rip from That 70s Show, a sitcom famous for its puff puff pass segments. It also uses drugs in the show not just for comical laughs, but also to tie in emotional moments with these characters. In many ways, the drug references in the show also drive the plot forward and create character growth. And what I personally love about Muppet Mayhem isn't that it feels like an old Cheech and Chong movie or an old episode of The Muppet Show, but that the Muppets had found a proper balance between their influences of the past and the Muppet charm many look for in the characters today. Also, taking the time to create an entire show based around just a few characters really led to some deeper discoveries from what had been B or C level characters in the ensemble. It's a show that made me fall further in love with the Electric Mayhem and opened up the possibilities to do more shows like it in the future based on just a few characters and the whole gang. Something I definitely believe is that the Muppets, being such pop culture figures, helped popularize certain types of comedy that still get used today. The influences of the Muppets, like stoner comedy, have been spit out the other side thanks to the popularity of Henson's characters. As much as people talk about the influence on comedy coming from people like Bob Hope, or Joan Rivers, or Robin Williams, I think that you can say that the Muppets have influenced comedy, and did so for many at a young age. Shows that are popular now, like The Office, aren't that far off from the Muppets. They're both ensemble casts, led by someone trying their best, but ultimately can't wrangle everyone together. Sketch comedy from people like Eric Andre or Tim Robinson have a chaotic energy that feels equivalent to the Muppets' you never know what's coming next kind of mentality of showrunning. The Muppets have endured tough times, and even if they hadn't, I think that they've left their mark on comedy, and the genre is better off because of the work that Henson and his characters did. Of course, the Muppets had other inspirations beyond drug culture, but I think it's difficult to separate the two. I mean, without the openness around drugs after the post-Hays Code, these characters would have never been the same. And if you're interested in creating your own character, your own puppet, you can now with Adam Krudiger's book, Puppetry 101, which is this week's sponsor for the show.
Hey, I already did the ad read.
Oh, so you told people that they could learn about script writing or creating their own puppet or learning to perform for the camera?
No, not really.
Okay, did you tell people that Adam is credible because he's worked on a bunch of different TV shows and YouTube channels and even opened his own camp?
I definitely didn't say any of that.
Okay, well, I guess you probably didn't tell people that this book is also for beginners and for longtime puppeteers who are looking to up their game. And you can find the book in the link below in our description, or just go to visit puppetnerd.com.
I did say some of that. Because money.
Cool. You were very helpful. Thanks. But I'm going to take good old Barry's stash here, toss it in the trash, find something more useful to do with my time.
Hey, Jack, I know it's late, you're out of town right now, but when you get back, what do you know about aerobics?
That sounds sick. Are you signing up for a class or something?
No class, just you and me in my living room. Hey, it's Editor Josh here. Thank you for watching this video. It's episode 3 in the current season of Modern Mouse, which is season 2. If you want to watch the rest of season 2, you can click the playlist right there. Also, I just want to say really quick, thanks one more time to, Puppetry 101. Check out the book in the link down below or at puppetrynerd.com. Fantastic book. I've actually been teaching myself puppetry with my little puppet here. I'm not very good yet, but I'm working on it. Hey, what? Always fading away.